thing which came across in a couple of your presentations, and sometimes explicitly, sometimes not, is that there appears to be the need for, if I understand this properly, you need a crisis, you come together as a community, and then you can act on the result. And if you, do we actually need the crisis in order to try to address it together? We obviously had a crisis drought in Nevada. Singapore has restricted access to water resources. Charles, you showed us a more global view, but again, the same thing. We all start at the same starting point, which is there's a crisis. And until we recognize the nature of the crisis, it's impossible to move forward. Is that the case?
I think it's endemic to human nature. We hate change. As human beings, we don't like to change. So the only thing that makes a community or an individual move is the need to do it. And so convincing the community or convincing the group that there is a significant enough reason to change, reason to do things differently, is foundational to get anybody to move. As long as you don't have to, you won't. That's unfortunately the reality of it.
So does that mean science has to focus on describing the problem, describing the crisis ahead of describing how to fix it if we're actually going to get anywhere?
Absolutely. And let me stop you right there. I think science's role is in describing the problem and laying out a smorgasbord of options. In other words, here are your sideboards, here's your risk. Now, community, how are you going to respond? And for each one of your response mechanisms, there are going to be pros and there are going to be cons. And it's amazing how, given the data, people will assimilate it. People will, but they want to travel that path themselves. They don't want to be told that I have discovered the problem, and here is the solution I am giving you. You will get nothing but resistance. Make them travel the journey in language that they can understand, in concepts that they can understand, which are laid out as consequences. And once they've traveled it themselves, then they are willing to make the changes. Because now it's not your solution thrust upon me, it is our solution. I have a part of that solution. I helped craft it.
Charles?
I fully agree with what you've just said. The danger in waiting, though, is that the price tag is going to go up on this. And I didn't have a chance to show this, but I learned recently of an interesting small river. Serves about 1.7 million people, 17,000 square kilometer river basin, not very large. It's in Japan. It's called the Yamatogawa River. I think it's in the Osaka region. And small drainage basin. Severe pollution because of the fact that people simply tolerated this and then they decided enough is enough. When they went to fix that river, and I didn't believe the numbers when I saw it, but I checked it, and those were the numbers given in this report. They spent $80 billion over about 40 years to reconstitute that river to the point where it could be used for recreation and fishing and things like this. And I wonder out loud how much the cost of prevention would have been. I don't think it would have been $80 billion. The rehabilitation was with a real price tag. Okay? Now imagine replicating this in many parts of the world. If we're constantly looking in the rearview mirror, the price tag is going to keep going up. And I think there are lots of examples where you could really prevent the problems from emerging in the first place at a much, much more reasonable cost.
Mm-hmm. Well, Singapore seems to be in a position to look ahead 30 years, to plan ahead. So how did you manage to make the switch? To get people to think more proactively? Was that an easy transition to make?
Actually, maybe we talk about crisis. Actually, we don't even have a luxury of talking about crisis. It's actually national survival, country's independence. Water is very important for the country's independence. So that's what drives us, in a way. That's what drives the population in terms of the understanding of the very, very important of water, for the independence of the country. So I think that part, the whole population understood it. So in a way, make our life in PUB much easier. So the question asked is that the question is how to avoid that crisis. So we need to look long term. In fact, today's best practices is not good enough for us because the assumptions are very different. The drivers are very different. For example, I was mentioning your luxury of years. We don't have. So we need to question the assumption. That's why we need to even question best practices, go beyond best practices to survive, right? To survive. So in a way, we do that. Over time, we came up with this what I call roadmap, where we post Singapore has the problem. You need a problem. You need what I call a uniting problem, a problem that unites everybody, right? So in Singapore context, is Singapore. So how to get water within that 700 square kilometer? It's not going to grow. We have a lot of competing land use, and yet we cannot deny an individual, we cannot deny an industry of water. If we do ever deny any of them, then the national confidence will drop. Investment will not come in, and Singapore will not survive. So that is the driver. So we need a very strong driver.
One that can adapt to changing conditions
Change,
as conditions change, which is why we embedded that 50-year planning horizon every single year. You don't do it once and put it away. Every single year you have to check your facts. You have to check your hydrology, you have to check your climate data, you have to check your development. What is the economy doing? What's the population doing? And then you have to develop a new 50-year plan.
So, you know, one thing that struck me in your talk was the fact that you managed to pull politics out of it. So, you know, it wasn't about left or right or Republican, Democrat. I mean, eventually that just became a sort of consensus. So the idea of pulling confrontation out. Now, you know, part of what Charles was talking about at the end was it's possible maybe if you have that confrontation, that whatever evidence, if you haven't gotten rid of it, whatever scientific evidence you're going to come up with is going to be interpreted whichever way, and you're not going to get to consensus. So is there something about the politics at the outset? Like if you can't solve the Gordian knot of who's for and who's against, yesterday Bob Ray talked about the us and them. If you don't solve that question, it doesn't matter how much science you get into it, you may not be able to solve the problem.
You never take and I hope that no one takes this wrong, but if somebody has a political label, they're identified with a certain party, a certain movement, and they become the messenger of the science, it instantly is non-credible to the other side. It has to be conveyed in an apolitical way. Get it out of the sound bites, make it something that is way too risky for somebody to go at. That's how we did it. We can now produce a letter to Congress signed by 7 governors, irrespective of their party, which then translates into action by 14 senators across the parties. And there's huge power in that. It has just been taken out of the political realm.
So does that give you cause for hope?
It depends how power is wielded. I agree with you that you need to have this level playing field, and let's just view facts as facts should be viewed. And let's not get emotional about things, but people tend to do that. And at the end of the day, and I can speak as an American, I guess, I'm really disheartened that in my lifetime, science was always lauded as, you know, a preeminence of U.S. scientists was unassailable. It really meant something if you were going to go into science. And because of really a political situation, particularly the climate question, scientists themselves have been assailed, and their credibility has been attacked. Their good judgment has been attacked, not really on the basis of fact And scientific debate, and we're always adjudicated, as it were, our statements are adjudicated, I like to say, by the peer review process. But when you put that into a political domain, all hell breaks loose. And I have to say that it's disheartening for me as a US citizen to see how the preeminence of science and scientists have really been attacked over the last many years, and because essentially the political process has put us into that position. But yeah, if we could just take the politics out of this, easier said than done, but evidently Pat's making some progress there, and that's heartening. But there is this broader context in which we all have to exist and make our statements and defend them.
And probably the greatest example of that is, when we were negotiating with Mexico, we had real confrontations with the State Department and Interior. It was the ultimate collision of the Treaty Clause in the United States Constitution and the Compact Clause. The United States had primacy in all international negotiations. The Compact gave the United States this much water with which to sit at the table with. You had to bring the states and the federal government together. So in an act of frustration, after several of the Mexican delegation reached out to us and said, this isn't going anywhere, I said, yes, get the talking heads out of the room. Put those people who actually know how the river works, who actually know what the consequences of decisions are, give them a 5-day period where every word on that page has the same meaning to everybody in that room. The minute we did that, it went through like greased lightning. Everything started to change. But this notion of put a proposal together on the US side, lob it across the border, it gets translated into Spanish with all their cultural and language nuances added onto it, then comes back as a non-starter, had to stop. That's what I'm trying to get at. Don't go in with preconceived outcomes. The outcomes will bubble up. Lay out the issues, lay out what the sidebars are, lay out what the options are, and then let the solutions bubble up.
So, we're going to get to your question in a second, but, that drives to me the question of also the funding of the research or the source of the research as a way to ensure its independence. What about in Singapore? How do you make those decisions? Where does the funding for the research that you rely on come from? Is that part of the solution to making sure that you get some independence going there?
Yes, in a way that actually through technology and knowledge, that's how we more or less demonstrated over the years that it solved our problem. And it's going to be our ongoing strategy. What today's best practices or even developed in Singapore or technology only buy us time. So we always on a constant lookout for new ideas, new technology, questioning even things like even reverse osmosis. Should I use RO as a way to convert seawater to fresh water? Is there a better way to do it? That's where in a way you frame the questions, then you develop the roadmap. Then of course funding. Funding is very important. But okay, funding is one equation, which is very important. So in terms of funding, there are two sources of funding in Singapore. One is, of course, we have a national level. They provide the funding, where it's either through universities, where they have independent research. They also have NRF, there's in a way run by my side. So in a way, we try to direct some of the research to meet the needs of Singapore. And then internally within PUB, we also allocate certain part of our revenue for R&D. We're talking about $20 million a year. But the problem is that sometimes it's not the money, it's funding. It's the lack of good ideas, right? So good ideas is a very precious commodity, very hard to come by, right? What are the game changer? We need to look out for how to look for the game changer, how to get our researchers, professors to think out the box, right? And yet have some sort of relate back to the reality today, you know. So that's what I'm coming from. And basically is the other equation is actually in Singapore, we are quite small. So, and we need 5 million people. So why 5 million limited? So we need to go out. So we're talking about billions of people running around. That's why we talk about collaborations and everything, leverage on each other to do a thing. Even though we want to do all the research that we want based on the funding, we don't have enough people to do it. So this is another challenges that we face in Singapore.
Right. So you're open to getting skills from outside in order to help you solve your problems, and part of it's a scale issue.
But we've also corrupted science in this country.
Yeah.
We have. I mean, if you are commercial enterprises have hired their science, and it is very directed in what the outcome is almost directed before the science begins, right? And we've done it whether it's on the environmental side, whether it's on the commercial side, we've directed it. And so if we don't like what comes back, why are we surprised? I mean, that's why one of the underpinnings for, you know, the conglomerate that the water utilities in the United States have through the Research Foundation, maintaining the integrity of that research is all important.
Right.
Actually, the other one is that we talk about research. And research, we cannot be very silo, just looking at water point of view.
Yes.
Actually, over time, we also internally, when we take one step back over the years and reflect back, we realize that actually water is not only the one part of the equation. The energy part and what I call the waste. Waste has a resource. So in a way, when now we talk about R&D, water, we also factor the energy equation. We also factor that if I were to treat the cubic meter of wastewater, or I produce cubic of drinking water, I try not to generate waste, because we don't have a luxury or space in Singapore for waste disposal. So it's running out. So that's where you go back to questioning even the treatment methods that we have. Like the wastewater itself, is there a better way to treat the wastewater in Singapore, right? Such that hopefully I don't generate any waste, and yet I produce energy, more energy than before. Maybe make my whole plant itself energy self-sufficient, which I think is possible. The science is there, but it's now a question is how to crack it, you know? Look for the efficient way to extract the energy out of wastewater.
Yeah.
But isn't the story of Singapore really the story of the world? I mean, we're going to go from 7 billion people to 9 billion people. As we pack this planet with more human beings who need more food, more energy, more drinking water, more sustainable ecosystems, the notion of wasting anything, no matter where you are on the planet, becomes really important. To me, it is mind-boggling that we never have that conversation. We have a global economy, we have a global population, and there's no such thing as a human being living on this planet without leaving some kind of a water footprint. The question is, how big is that water footprint? And bringing that water footprint down to as small a footprint as we can possibly manage, if we're going to survive as a planet, becomes all important.
Absolutely.
Let me just throw a little wrench into this, if I could, being provocative a little bit.
Okay.
I understand the challenges of Singapore, and I really laud what you've done. I've visited some of the labs there. Really spectacular facilities, really wonderful thinking about how to use every single drop of water. You had a public media campaign to get people to accommodate the reuse of water, so that was brilliant in its own right. But Singapore is a rich country. Last time I looked, it's near the top of the list of per capita incomes. The kinds of things that you're doing, as adaptive as they might be for Singapore, may not find a home in sub-Saharan Africa or India, poor parts of the world. And let's face it, most of the 9 or maybe 10 billion people on the planet are not going to be at the level of Singapore in terms of their capacity to afford this kind of stuff. That was my point, that we could either go the expensive route, which we've done in the developed world, or if we're looking at this mass of a brand new, many extra billions of people moving into the middle class, do we want them to use the same kinds of approaches that are very expensive, let's face it, that we've used in the developed world? Or do we want to think a little bit more out of the box and understand that, well, maybe working with nature is going to reduce your price tag? And I think that that's really the fundamental game changer if we're looking at sustainability and we're looking also at economic development, which seems to be the motto for the 21st century. And we're going to have this enormous new middle class that has to have its water needs met. I'm not certain that it will be done in the way that Singapore has done. I'm just
Actually,
put a little cold water on the subject.
Well, I'm going to push back, and I'm going
It's-
to push
it's-
back and help him here a little bit.
No,
Go
maybe
ahead.
I just answered your question. Actually, nobody realized that actually 50 years ago, we are undeveloped. We are high unemployment, pollution was worse, and we need time to develop. What I say is right. You need economic growth. You need people to level up in terms of education, social knowledge, and everything before you can talk about what I'm talking today. So, but it's not a lost cause for those developing countries. That's why sometimes when at international conference I present on new water, I have to be very careful. Because when I talk new water, I got a guy from Africa or from every place, wow, I want to do it in my country. I say, no, settle the base, get the basics right. Okay, of course, I don't want to go into other issues, into politicals, about other things, but just talk about technical. You need the infrastructure. You need to get your basics right. Then when you get basics right, then the reward will come later. So in our situation, like new water and everything and the growth, it's a reward of our investments. Because if you go back to 1960s, we are poor. We are poor. You look at the GDP, I think we are at the bottom. But somehow our political masters understood the importance of the environment. So even though we had limited revenue, the percentage of the money went into infrastructure. We don't grow at the expense of the environment. So industries, wherever there is any, we're putting water pollution controls and everything, all right? And in fact, we borrow money for the World Bank at 3%. So in a way, they create some discipline to us, right? So then it's over time. So if you there's one presentation done by my chairman, and it shows in terms of where we are today. It's not because it's by that we of everything, but it's more to the social, economic development and growth. Then that's why we create this opportunity. So you ask me in South Africa, Africa itself or India, I think they need to tackle the basics pollution first, right? So I think India is looking into that. Whether they have a political will, that's another question, right? But the answers are there actually.
And I think the question, it's a global question. It's not whether we can afford it, it's whether we can afford not to do it. Because the social unrest, the epidemic diseases that get caused by neglect and not investing in technology solutions and in protecting the environment and doing the things that need to be done around water in those underdeveloped parts of the world are going to affect us in the developed parts of the world. Let's get real about this. So in my mind, it has always been a question of can we afford not to do it, not can we afford to do it. Because if you decide you can't afford not to do it, trust me, you'll find a way to make the money.
Right. Thanks for that. Now, and I want to thank you for your patience up there. Would you mind introducing yourself?
My name's Nicole Wilson. I'm a PhD student at the University of British Columbia. And actually, my question is specifically for Pat. Yesterday, we talked a lot about Indigenous water governance and the importance of self-determination for Indigenous people in water governance. And so bringing that thread into this discussion about going from knowledge to action. In the Columbia River Basin, how were the tribes involved and tribal water rights considered in this negotiation process? And my question is specific to the Columbia River Basin, but I think there's application for all over the world. So.
Right. And that's a very good question, because we have any number of tribal nations in the Colorado River Basin. And the way their water rights are established and settled and who works with them is the states, because they are a part of that state's compact allocation. Now, some nations transcend state boundaries, so they have dual. There have been any number of Indian water rights settlements, and you have seen the states and the tribes start coming together much more cohesively in terms of moving forward. And projects are being then pushed through Congress to help, like the Navajo Nation. That was the most recent one. It's an ongoing struggle, and it's embedded in that relationship between the state and the tribe.
Hi, is this? Yeah, thanks. Jeff Riggs with IBM. I'm actually a colleague of Jean-Francois, and I owe him a favor. So nicely moderated panel, my friend. Hopefully that squares us up a little. My neurons are always popping when I'm witness to this kind of talent. So terrific panel, excellent perspectives. Thank you very much. So I'll throw maybe a broader type of question, and feel free to answer all or part of it. It was kind of catalyzed by Pat's rousing remarks at the beginning, but I think this applies to all three of you. And I don't enjoy putting panelists on the spot, but I feel compelled a little to maybe put a Canadian context around this a little bit here. We talk about kind of boiling it down to legislative or economic or social or technology kind of impetus for action. And I've had the pleasure of speaking at CWN events before, and I referenced Singapore's dire need and a disaster to get us going kind of thing. Can we boil that? Can you maybe take a run at boiling that down, pardon the pun, for in a Canadian context? What is our dire need here? Because I think all places have a dire need, and we've talked about it from a global perspective, but I wonder if you have a Canadian opinion on that. And also, not to be remiss in mention of technology, not just technology that IBM is involved in, but technology more broadly. Is there Canadian technology that you've witnessed in your global perspective that's really important for us to be, turning into, action, let's say? So thanks for considering that.
I can't speak for Canadian technology per se, but I did try to make the point that I think if we begin to think of the word sustainability, that's a hard word to define, and I think we know what non-sustainable practices are, and I guess we had a discussion over a couple of glasses of wine, and look over Saudi Arabia and you see these center pivot irrigation systems right in the middle of the desert, and they're tapping into groundwater, and you would clearly say that that's not sustainable. I'm trying to think out several generations. What are the implications of doing what we're doing today? What does that have to promote in terms of sustainability in a multi-generational sense? What are we going to be facing if, for example, I've studied world's delta systems, and right now Bangladesh is a very, very vulnerable state in terms of sea level rise. Right now, Amsterdam is not, okay? And the reason Amsterdam's not is that, they're getting hit by sea level rise. In fact, much of Amsterdam's under sea level right now. And the way they prevent disaster is by investing huge amounts of money to protect themselves. And that's all well and good. And today, I'd rather be sitting in Amsterdam than I would be in Bangladesh. But fast forward 2, 3, 4, 5 generations when energy is going to be very expensive, if who knows what it's going to look like. The world would be a much more populated place. There's going to be a lot more demand on all of our resources. Is that kind of investment, as the ocean continues to rise and these systems are continuing to sink, do you want to be sitting in Amsterdam in the year 2250, where huge dikes will certainly have to be invested in, or some other ways of thinking through the problem are going to have to be the norm of the day? And again, I think if you look at this from a long-term sustainability perspective, Canada might be sitting pretty right now in terms of the technologies it can throw at, for example, its municipal water supplies. And I sat in the urban dialogue yesterday, and you're doing amazing things today, but it also costs money, and it takes a lot of energy. And I just wonder out loud if we're going to see those kinds of systems in play, 100 years or 200 years from now. And I think we really have to take the long perspective, because what we do now by the kinds of systems we install is potentially permanently damage those renewable systems that we're going to be looking to in the future. And I think we have to be really smart about how we develop, because we're going to look in the rearview mirror once again and say, whoops, we lost that asset, we lost this asset, and then when we try to piece it back together, the check at the end of the meal is going to be pretty high.
The question about Canada, I'm going to throw right back at you. I don't think there is a Canadian risk assessment out there, because you have as much diversity in Canada as we do in the United States in terms of river systems and watersheds, and every one of those. Sitting here, it would be a little presumptuous of any one of us to say, this is the Canadian problem. This is your bucket of risks. My question to you is, why are you having this conference? You must see some risk. You must have some vision of where the potential dangers are. And in every region of Canada, what does that bucket look like? And what are those risks? And can you afford to wait 20, 30 more years until you start looking at them? Or do you feel there's enough urgency that it's time to look at those risks and those exposures ice cold in the face?
That's a great point about maybe localization of the issue, because you're right, we're broad and diverse here, and we have a bucket of risks, whereas Singapore, quite small in your geographic focus, so perhaps that was an enabler for you, which I think Harry mentioned earlier on. So, is that something that we should be focused more on, is kind of driving knowledge into local areas of action?
I think the in Canada, like Pat said, I think we can't speak for Canada, but from my perception is that you are blessed with a lot of water. So your drivers are very different. Your drivers to manage your water over the short term, long term is very different from us. I do not understand about all your local water rights. We even talk about US about water rights. Australia talk about it. I have no inkling, because we don't have water rights. We don't have luxury of water rights in Singapore.
Right.
All right, because the water itself is. So I suppose Canada had to take one step back and then frame your own water questions, than from an outsider, all right, into long-term, short-term, long-term. I don't know who's going to do it in Canada. I leave it to you all, right? But I don't think talk about technology. In fact, Canada get a lot of technologies. We actually, in fact, use some technology from Canada. We got Empire, we got this Xenon, now sold to GE, right? And in fact, I think in terms of technology capabilities, is there. Its question is how to export or get utilized. And I think you can find all the solutions within Canada itself.
Thank you. Yeah.
Might I put a little plug in for the fact that the United States is going to be taking over the chairmanship for a 2-year period of the Arctic Council. And one of the focal points for that chairmanship is going to be clean drinking water and sanitation in the circumarctic region. And I heard yesterday some of the very same issues here in Canada in terms of First Nations with the villages that we hear in terms of what's happening, for example, in Alaska. I hear stories as well in Russia that this kind of thing's happening. So maybe that would be a way that we could all join hands and use perhaps Canadian technology for some low-cost, appropriate kinds of technologies that you would use in these rural villages that are really suffering, really developing world, third world kinds of problems in terms of their sanitation and public health risk.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I'm sorry, I think I'm holding people away from their coffee. So I think I'm going to thank my speakers, and thank you for that last question, which brought it back to Canada.